In 2013, Assassin's Creed Black Flag was released and it's still a really good game. It has a solid story, great gameplay, and it nails the thrill of being a pirate. At least the fun aspects of it, you don't actually get scurvy while being stuck in the middle of nowhere. Sailing the high seas and getting into pirate adventures in Black Flag is something that never gets old. The game did have a problem however, and it was that it would often lean too heavily into the Assassin's Creed part and too little into the Black Flag part. Too many times, Black Flag's pacing would be bogged down by tailing, eavesdropping, and escort missions. Ubisoft would set out to fix that with the game's two expansions. The first one, Freedom Cry, released in early 2014, and it's definitely an expansion that released in early 2014. The second expansion was going to be a multiplayer affair focused purely on naval battles. This was assigned to Ubisoft Singapore, a relatively new studio that had previously worked on Ghost Recon Phantoms, a multiplayer shooter that was received about as well as a wet fart. The expansion would become too big in scope, and eventually it was decided that a fully fledged pirate MMO would be made, codenamed Black Flag Infinite. More time would pass, and Ubisoft Singapore once again changed its mind. In E3 2017, Skull and Bones was announced, and it would be a multiplayer game focused on 5v5 naval battles, with a release date set for 2018. Fast forward a year, and Skull and Bones would be delayed for 2019, but now it had yet another new direction, as it showed a trailer where two ships cooperated in taking down a big warship. With 2019 rolling around, the game was once again delayed to sometime after March 2020. While no new footage was released, the game's direction apparently changed again, this time inspired by survival games like Ark Survival Evolved. 1 year later, the game would be delayed yet again until 2022, and this time it would definitely, surely, pinky promise, be a live service pirate game. It would yet again be delayed until 2023, and then until February 2024, when it finally released 11 long years after it started development. Prior to the game's release, people weren't happy about the game's price. As per usual Ubisoft pricing standards, you had to pay $80 for the base game and you could pay $30 more for like an extra mission and 3 used napkins. Ubisoft CEO Yves Guillemot defended this price by saying that Skull and Bones would be the first ever quadruple A game. Let's zoom out a bit. What is a quadruple A game? An indie game is a game developed by a few developers that have independently secured their funding. A AA game is a game made by a developer with a mid-tier budget, and a AAA game is a game with a very big budget. Does that mean that a quadruple A game has an even bigger budget than a AAA game? Technically yes, as Skull and Bones reportedly had a budget of $200 million, but not all of it was paid by Ubisoft. According to a 2021 article by The Gamer, the Singaporean government made generous subsidies to Ubisoft for the game. As you can see, Skull and Bones had an incredibly tumultuous development cycle. It may have been in development for 11 years, but a lot of that time was spent without a coherent vision, and managers constantly changing as the next manager in line scrapped the work of the previous one. Ubisoft wanted to cancel the game, but the Singaporean government disagreed, and thus Skull and Bones finally shipped on February 13th, 2024. So let's dive into Skull and Bones' world, and let's all find out what a quadruple A game is, shall we? Let's check it out. Now, I know we've done a lot of behind the scenes talk, but we're going to have to do just a bit more. A few days prior to the game's release, Elizabeth Pellen, an ex-creative director over at Ubisoft Singapore that left the division in 2023, said that making a solo campaign would have prevented Ubisoft Singapore from creating a deep open world. I really hope that pun was intended. The game does have a narrative, however, technically. Skull and Bones starts off impressively. You enter a big fight which you eventually lose, which leads to your ship getting sunk and 2 other members of the crew finding you washed ashore the day after. That's where you meet 2 people that seem important to your journey since they become the highest ranking members of your ship, but you actually will never directly talk to them after this cutscene. The game's only cutscene, mind you. I have a feeling that this cutscene is where Ubisoft Singapore decided to drop the story portion of the game. They just made one cutscene and called it a decade. The rest of the game's story develops by you going to your local kingpin and him or her assigning you a random task. That's about it. There are no characters, and even though you get told about the actions of other factions, you never get to see them for yourself. Even the villains that mark the end boss fights of each act don't have a face or a voice, it's just a name slapped on top of a ship. Even with close to no story, the game manages to waste your time by having vendors tell you their life story before selling you anything. I ended up skipping most of the dialogue, and I doubt I missed anything. I will now be spoiling the game's ending. There's barely anything to spoil here, but I might as well leave a warning. After defeating the game's final boss, you go back to your local kingpin and she basically tells you thanks for the help and that's it. No credits, no trophy, no message saying thanks for playing a shitty game but there's more to do. Nothing. You just beat it and nothing happens. I almost gaslit myself into thinking that there's more, but after 20 minutes of looking it up, I came to the conclusion that I beat the main story. What an anticlimactic ending to a terrible campaign. It's all up to the gameplay now. Alright, look, maybe the story is a barely existent mess, but this is a pirate game. How hard could it be to make it fun? And you already have a blueprint of how to do this type of stuff with Assassin's Creed Black Flag. There, I just got my sip. Let's see what adventure Skull and Bones has in store for me. Skull and Bones completely misunderstands how a pirate game should work. About 10% of the game is combat, 10% is bootleg Minecraft, and the other 80% is sailing. Let's take them in order. The game's combat is by far and away its most fun aspect. The bar is set so low that I could step on it, but there is some enjoyment to be had here. The naval combat is very similar to that of Assassin's Creed Black Flag. You fire your cannons, then brace from incoming fire. Fights are generally enjoyable and your weapons pack a decent amount of power. But now that the naval combat is over, boarding the ship is where the real fun begins. You had one job. If this was a World of Warships type of deal where I'm presuming it's a lot more difficult to board a 58,000 ton behemoth, I'd understand. But these are old school pirate ships. Why does a pirate game not include the most fun part of being a pirate? I'm not going to say that they had 11 years to do this because it's obvious that this version of the game was developed in a lot fewer years than that, but couldn't the best part of being a pirate have been prioritized? What's next, Call of Duty without guns? At least I really appreciated the fact that as you got bigger and better weapons, they did make a tangible difference in gameplay. How you get those weapons, however, is a masterclass in how to make a game as boring as possible. In order to get new weapons and ships, you have to play bootleg Minecraft where you sail around mining and collecting materials. About 2 weeks after the game's launch, Ubisoft claimed record engagement stats with players logging in over 4 hours of daily playtime. And I mean, yeah, I bet that's true because that's how long it takes for you to find all the materials for a ship. This is some of the most boring stuff I've ever had the displeasure of doing in a game, and it doesn't even come close to the game's most boring activity. Sailing is what you'll predominantly be doing in Skull and Bones, and it's one of the most tedious things I've ever done. It's right up there with watching paint dry as well as watching any England game these past few years. I know what some of you will say, if you didn't like sailing, do you even like pirate games? Well, to answer that, I'd like to show you how other games did sailing well. Assassin's Creed Black Flag's sailing was very simplistic. You had 3 different speeds to choose from and off you went. Sailing itself wasn't great in that game, but it's the juxtaposition with all the other stuff you could do in the game that made it fun. After you were done parkouring, assassinating and stealthing around the Caribbean islands, you could hop into a ship, get into a naval battle and then repeat the cycle on the next island. All of those ingredients on their own are decent, but it's their combination that made Black Flag so good. Skull and Bones can't offer that juxtaposition, so let's check out another example. Sea of Thieves is very similar to Skull and Bones. Although it has a lot more on-land activities, most of your time there will also be spent sailing. What Sea of Thieves does though is that it makes the sailing itself a fun challenge. You have to control the anchors, set the sails, close off any potential holes after you inevitably crash, and figure out how to navigate to your next destination as there are no markers. It's something that also encourages a lot of people to split their roles in one ship, as one can help with navigation and the other with steering the ship, for example. Skull and Bones forgoes all of that and asks an interesting question. What if we took Black Flag sailing and made it annoying? Skull and Bones offers no mechanical challenge and it basically copies Black Flag's sailing system but adds a stamina bar. So the speed you actually want to be going in is only accessible for about 30 seconds before you have to wait for it to regenerate. I usually don't look at my phone when I play games, especially when I want to focus on a good story or I find the gameplay engaging. In Skull and Bones, I must have spent more time on my phone than the game itself while waiting for my ship to get anywhere. You know, I think Ubisoft Singapore made a mistake with the game's marketing. With a slight shift in target audience, Skull and Bones could have been a major hit. All they had to do was market it as sleep medication for insomniacs. The game also happens to be very glitchy as well. Shocker, I know. It literally locked me off doing the smuggling network missions, which from my understanding is a big part of the endgame, so if you wanted to hear my thoughts on that, you won't. The final boss is also a glitchy mess. Spoiler alert, I guess. First of all, it's a very unfair fight as you're tasked with fighting about 10 ships at the same time, while the ships that are supposed to help you are slightly less useful than Until Dawn getting a remaster. On my fourth attempt, I found the boss with a sliver of health remaining fighting an AI ship, and so I finished him off. That obviously didn't count, so I went into his zone to spawn him again, only for no other ships to spawn and him almost immediately getting stuck into a rock while I dropped everything I had on him. I sincerely doubt I would have beaten him had he not become one with a random rock outside of his boss arena. But it's fitting, a broken final boss for a fundamentally broken game. The game is online only and its multiplayer aspects are a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you can have moments like when a random swooped in to save me while I was struggling with plundering an outpost, and other times, other people can do entire missions for you if you're lucky enough to join them just before they're done. This happened to me twice, once with a 95% plundered outpost and once with the first act's final boss. While no official sales numbers are out yet, Skull and Bones did not crack 1 million players when it launched. For a game with a $200 million budget, this is a very low number. This is a live service game, and although I find it shocking that anybody expects from players to not only beat the game but to come back for seconds, Ubisoft Singapore is still updating it. The game just launched on Steam as I'm writing this, opening with a mixed response. Knowing Steam reviews, that's a lot more positive than I expected. So after all that, what is a quadruple A game after all? I think I figured it out. It's a mediocre pile of garbage that doesn't even come close to Ubisoft's standard of highly polished mediocrity. When I did my retrospective on Immortals of Aveum, I mentioned how despite not liking the game, I could see a potential for something better in a sequel. With Skull and Bones, I don't see it. This might be the first game I've played that I felt relieved after beating it. My day genuinely got better after I realized I didn't have to play it anymore. I guess that's an achievement in itself, but Ubisoft Singapore? I'd appreciate it if you made anything but another pirate game. And that was my analysis of Skull and Bones. If you want to watch how EA spent $125 million on a game that flopped, click this video to watch my retrospective on Immortals of Aveum. See you in the next one.